C.3.1 here. So let's start with the levels of bioorganization. Very simple, very easy. GCC recap. Cells are level 1. A group of cells makes up a tissue, which makes up an organ, well, a group of tissues, which then the organs make up organ systems, followed by organisms. Emergent properties arise due to the integration of subsystems. So an emergent property would be the cheetah speed. Let's have a look at three different causes of this subsystem or adaptations for this subsystem. So it has an aerodynamic head to reduce wind resistance when it's sprinting. Then there's the long muscular tail that's going to stabilize its body so it doesn't fall over to the side, and the semi-retractable claws that provide traction when, again, sprinting. Now, it's not necessary to know like very specific adaptations that help in certain emergent properties. It's just good to know some examples to understand this concept. Nervous system, okay. Two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The CNS is made up of the brain and spinal cord only, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is any other nerves, neurons that are not part of the CNS. Okay, so the other nerves of the body. Now, it contains the efferent or motor nervous system, which is very important for muscle contractions and general control. It's divided into two subsections of its own. The autonomic nervous system or automatic nervous system, responsible for involuntary actions, and the somatic nervous system responsible for voluntary actions, such as moving your hand, speaking, etc. Now the autonomic is divided again into sympathetic, meaning increasing, and parasympathetic, decreasing nervous systems. Looking at the endocrine system, it's going to release or secrete hormones through its endocrine glands, and these hormones are going to be transported by blood. Okay, blood is very important because it can also transport oxygen from the alveoli of the lungs to our cells for aerobic respiration, and the CO2 from these cells that is released from aerobic respiration back to the lungs for it to be expelled. Then it also transports nutrients from the small intestine where these nutrients are assimilated, okay? So they go from the small intestine into our blood, and then the waste materials to our organs, such as the kidneys or skin. Okay, this isn't as relevant to this topic, but it's very good to know in the IP course. Now, the nervous system is going to use electrical signals as communication, whereas the endocrine system is going to use chemical signals. Very important. The nervous system is faster than the endocrine system, but the endocrine system has longer lasting effects, okay? Hormonal effects last longer than the nervous system effects. Now, let's have a deeper look at the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is heavily linked with the enteric nervous system, which is responsible for coordinating and controlling digestion. Now, it's going to cause peristalsis or food movement, as well as the release and mixing of digestive enzymes, vomiting reflex when you see something disgusting and you want to vomit, and blood flow for nutrient absorption, so very important functions. Next up, it works independently, but it is connected to the autonomic nervous system of the PNS, not CNS, but the CNS does control it, okay? It does control it, but it's part of the PNS. Now, different functions. Swallowing is not a function of the enteric nervous system. It's function of the voluntary central nervous system. But once food enters the esophagus, the ENS this time will take over until defecation, where defecation is egestion. Okay, so until egestion, and after the food has entered the esophagus, the ENS takes over, carrying out these functions. Now, defecation is normally voluntary, and it is controlled by the central nervous system again. The cerebrum is the biggest part of the brain, and it has two hemispheres, two symmetrical parts of the brain. So your brain's divided into two. Now, it contains the parietal lobe, frontal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, where the main functions are senses, movement, and thinking. Next structure, the cerebellum, is responsible for somatic or voluntary functions, and it also has two hemispheres. Now, the brainstem is right here, is responsible for autonomic or automatic functions, and it's divided into three parts. I'll use different shapes to label where they are approximately. So the midbrain, around here in the middle of the brain, followed by the pons and the medulla, which is very important because it links the brain with the other part of the central nervous system, or the CNS, which is the spinal cord. Let's have a deeper look into the cerebellum. Remember that the cerebellum has two hemispheres, the left cerebellar hemisphere and the right cerebellar hemisphere. Now the left cerebellar hemisphere with the right cerebrum, remember that the cerebrum is the big structure with the four lobes, control your left side, and similarly the right cerebellar hemisphere plus the left cerebrum control your right side. The cerebellum has the following functions: the coordination of voluntary or somatic movements, the balance and posture, using inputs, this is an important word, from receptors such as proprioceptors and others that we're going to look at later in this video. And then there's the motor movement skills learning. Okay, so these are skills that require movement. So learning this movement, for example, learning to write. Okay, you are coordinating with your hand and your brain to write. Okay, so this is a function of the cerebellum. Motor skills, also known as procedural skills, if you do psychology. Now, the inputs, this keyword that we looked at here, are mainly from the cerebrum, the big structure, but it also receives signals from the brainstem and the spinal cord, all part of the central nervous system. Let's look at different parts of your central nervous system, okay? Remember that it's the spinal cord and the brain, okay? So looking at deeper structures in the brain, more inside the brain. The pituitary gland, also known as the master gland, is going to secrete many different hormones, such as ADH, okay? Then there's the amygdala, which is responsible for the formation of emotional memories and other functions. The hippocampus, that forms declarative memories. This is more of psychology stuff, but just remember that these structures exist. And the hypothalamus, that is responsible for homeostasis, regulation of temperature, and other things. This is a topic in IB biology as well. Have it in mind. As I said before, all of this is the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system, again, is any other nerve which is not part of the brain and spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord integrates info from reflexes, okay? And it's a relay system, very important keyword, between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. An example of a reflex, okay, is the knee jerk or patellar reflex, right here on your knees. Moving on to reactions. Every reaction starts with a stimulus that can be, for example, a punch coming towards you if you're boxing. The receptors in your eyes and so the photoreceptors in your eyes, for example, that see light are going to view this punch, okay, because without light you wouldn't be able to see anything. So that would be an example of a receptor. Maybe your proprioceptors detect some wind from the punch, okay, so there's different receptors in hand here, not just a certain specific one. Then there's the coordinator. It can be your different parts of the brain. Then there's the effectors, which are the muscles. Okay, they can be muscles or glands. in this case, maybe your adrenal glands would secrete more adrenaline to increase your heart rate, and so you move faster. But some muscles in your body would definitely start moving. For example, your legs would move if the response would be a dodge, maybe not as amazing as this one, but you would definitely need to move your legs to dodge the punch. Okay, this is more of a simplified version of what it looks like. It's also relevant in sports science. Now, the coordinator uh, the brain, have a certain capability called plasticity. This is also relevant in IB psychology, where it's the process of adding, strengthening, or removing synapses from the interneurons in the brain that we'll look at in a second. Okay, and learning is going to cause changes in neuron connections. Okay, so your brain actually physically changes when you learn stuff. Okay, because it's going to add, strengthen, or remove certain synapses of the neurons we're going to look at in a second. And this is called plasticity. And memory is a cognitive process as well that can change the neural connections. And it is the storage and recall of learning. Storage meaning, well, storing, you know what it means. And recall is like remembering what you've learned. Okay, more in depth into memory, have in mind that it's stored by an interconnection, not by one single location. So there's not a single part of the brain, for example, here, that's going to store all your memory. No, it's divided basically between the whole brain. Okay, that's where your memory is divided. Two types of memory to have a look at. Implicit memory. This involves things such as skills, habits, and it's subconscious. Okay, so motor skills, for example, like writing, as I said before, the example I used before, that would be implicit. And explicit declarative memory, which are facts, knowledge, just conscious things. Now, this is very relevant to the last slide, the three types of neurons. Sensory neurons, they're going to be around the skin, for example, and they're the first neurons to detect senses, okay, such as touch, smell, taste, etc. And they act as receptors. They're going to send signals to the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, which contain interneurons. Remember, inside. So they're inside the central nervous system. So they're basically acting within the central nervous system, not yet to effectors. That's the role of motor neurons. Okay, motor neurons grab the information from the coordinator in the central nervous system and send it to effectors. That could be your muscles or your glands. Have in mind that sensory neurons are afferent. Let's spell it right here. Not great, right here. Well, they're afferent. This is horrible writing. I am extremely sorry, but I think you can understand it. Afferent, and motor neurons are efferent. Efferent, okay? This is going to be explained in more detail in a second. This slide is to have more of a look at receptors, okay? So these receptors act with sensory neurons. They are, for example, free nerve endings in the skin, okay? This is an example of a terminal button of a neuron, okay? Terminal buttons are basically the edges of these parts of the dendrites, okay? And they connect with the skin right here. Okay, we're going to look at that in a second as well. And they are specialized cells. Let's have a look at the different types of receptors. First, have in mind that information goes from the receptors in the skin to the terminal buttons of the sensory neurons, okay, the terminal buttons of the dendrites, and they're going to send the information to the interneurons of the central nervous system, which are going to figure something out, figure a movement out, and they're going to send it to the motor neurons, the efferent neurons. Remember that the sensory neurons are afferent. So they're going to send this message to the motor neurons. They're going to cause the effectors, the muscles or glands, to cause an effect, to a movement, for example, or a secretion of a certain substance. Now, again, different types of receptors. Thermal receptors. Thermal is linked to temperature. It can be high, it can be low. That's the role. Mechanoreceptors. Okay, they're divided into two types. Baroreceptors, which detect blood pressure. Remember B for blood pressure. Um, and proprioceptors, there should be an R here, which detect tension and stretch in muscles and tendons. Okay, this is sports science, but they would detect in muscles, there would be muscle spindles, and in tendons, it would be Golgi tendon organs. You don't need to know that if you don't do sports science, just nice to know. And then there's chemoreceptors, which detect chemical levels such as pH, whether it's alkali, acid, CO2 levels, or oxygen levels. Nociceptors detect pain. Sorry, I had to cough there a second. Anyways, they detect pain in organs such as the skin. They can detect pain in internal organs as well. And yes, the skin is the largest organ in the body. Then there's electromagnetic receptors, which detect electromagnetic energy, such as light. Okay, and if we're specifically talking about light, the role of detecting light is of photoreceptors. Remember, photosynthesis, which needs light. There you go. Now, finally, let's have a look at sensory neurons. Let's go. Sensory neurons. First thing to know, these neurons have longer dendrites than other neurons, so they can go deeper into the skin, which contains receptors, okay? The receptors that we've just seen. Well, some of them actually. Nociceptors, for example, will be on the skin detecting pain. Some others will be in the blood or around the heart, okay? My bad for that. It's got a nucleus right here. It's got an axon as well, any neuron, and the impulse direction goes from the skin, okay, from the long dendrites that are in the skin. So it's going to go up into the eventually spinal cord of the CNS. So basically, it's afferent because it carries information from the receptors around the skin to the central nervous system, starting with the spinal cord. Next up, we're looking at interneurons. Okay, we've done sensory neurons. Next up is interneurons. I'm not sure what happened to the motor neurons here. We're gonna look at them as well. Okay, let's go. Okay, first thing, I know this diagram is very detailed, but we don't need to know like all the details or anything. Just look at a brief explanation. So this goes back to sensory neurons. So there's going to be receptors in the skin, for example, such as nociceptors detect the pain. Okay, then the impulse is going to move uh, from the sensory neurons, okay, into the spinal cord, and eventually it's going to reach the brain. Okay, so it's going to reach the brain right here. You'll see that there's an interneuron. Remember that first it goes through the spinal cord. Now it reaches the interneurons, and basically what they do is send messages within the brain. Okay, these messages are sent within the brain, and eventually they're going to reach motor neurons. Okay, and from the motor neurons, they're going to move to effectors, the muscles. They can also be glands. Okay. Okay, so I fixed my motor neurons, which are efferents, okay? They're efferents because they carry information from the CNS to effectors, as I said before. Let's have a deeper look at them right now. Let's go. Motor neurons, finally, these are more detailed. First up, we have the two types of motor neurons. Upper motor neurons, which carry impulses from the brain to the spinal cord. Remember, upper is going to be higher the brain. The brain is higher up in your body than the spinal cord, okay? So it moves down from the brain to the spinal cord, from up in the brain to lower the spinal cord. Now, lower motor neurons carry impulses from the spinal cord to finally the muscles, okay? Upper, lower. Next, these motor neurons have a single long axon. This is different to sensory neurons. They don't have a single long axon. We know that there's like a gap for the nucleus, which is right here in sensory neurons, okay? In this case, it's not going to be present. And another thing, they have numerous dendrites, okay? Now, they're going to use the contraction of skeletal and smooth muscles. Skeletal muscles are going to be muscles which are attached to bones, okay? So for example, you have the humerus here, so we know the biceps, the triceps, your shoulder delts, they're attached to your humerus, your bone in the arm. Then there's the radius in the ulna. This is sports science, but it's good to know what skeletal muscle is. The forearm muscles are attached to the bones, okay? So muscles which are attached to bones. And smooth muscle is muscle that's in your internal organs, okay? So we know that the heart has smooth muscles. I don't know, like the left ventricle, your lungs also has smooth muscle. They're not attached to bones. They're smooth. Now these are going to enable movement such as walking, speaking, and in the case of smooth muscle, such as in the lungs, functions such as breathing, heart beating, etc. Let's look at the different types of nerves and nerve fibers, starting with sensory nerves with sensory that contain sensory axons, motor nerves with motor axons, and mixed nerve with both sensory and motor axons. Now looking at myelinated nerve fibers, um, we'll see that the motor neurons have a myelin sheath, and this sheath is produced by Schwann cells of the peripheral nervous system and oligodendrocytes of the central nervous system. Now, these will act as an insulating layer, okay, for the electricity, because it's like a wire, okay? You don't want the electricity to spill out everywhere, okay? You want it to flow through the axon smoothly, okay? And how does this energy flow? Well, it does that through the nodes of Ranvier. It jumps from one to the other, okay? We've looked at myelinated nerve fibers with the myelin sheath, and now let's look at when the myelin sheath is absent, and that's what you call an unmyelinated nerve fiber, where, as I said, myelin sheath is absent, nerve impulses move continuously down the axon, and they do so slower. Another thing, gray matter, okay, gray matter is, well, it's represented in this diagram as well. It's composed of cell bodies of neurons. And when it comes to white matter, note that myelin sheath, gives its color. It causes the white color. Reflex actions. These are going to be automatic and spontaneous responses to stimuli. Let's have a look at an example. The diagram may seem very complex, but it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Well, first, this is going to be the reflex arc, okay? So a reflex action will have a reflex arc, like a movement. And it's going to start at step number 1, okay? So a finger is going to touch this hot pan. Touching a hot pan stimulates nociceptors, pain receptors. It's also going to stimulate thermoreceptors, I guess. So the impulse is sent. It's going to move down through the nerves, okay? It's going to travel via sensory neurons, okay, because They're in the skin. Remember, sensory neurons are in the skin. And then it's going to move to the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now we're moving on to the central nervous system. Okay, moves to the gray matter, and then it's going to pass to the interneurons. Okay, remember the brain has interneurons, so it's going to move around the brain through those. Now the impulse is going to travel down to the motor neurons of the muscles of the arm. Okay, now it's around here through the motor neurons, and the muscles are going to contract, pulling the hand away. Okay, so it's going to go from here to here. Simple. The medullary cardiovascular control center, through sympathetic increasing or parasympathetic decreasing stimulation, is going to regulate the following: heart rate, cardiac output, and respiratory rate. Okay, if you do sports science, this is also relevant. So listen up. It's going to receive signals from baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Okay, and looking at baroreceptors, firstly, when blood pressure is low, because remember that they examine blood pressure, they're going to signal to this medullary cardiovascular control center, pardon my pronunciation, and they're going to detect reduced arterial stretch when blood pressure is low. Now, this leads to sympathetic stimulation. If our blood pressure is low, we want to increase it, and that's why it leads to sympathetic and not parasympathetic stimulation. Now, this is going to cause an increase in the following: stroke volume, heart rate, and therefore blood pressure, as well as the vasoconstriction of blood vessels. This essentially means we're making the blood vessels tighter, and because it's tighter, there's going to be more blood pressure as well. Now, what about the opposite? What about when blood pressure is high? Okay, again, we're going to signal to this control center. The baroreceptors are going to detect an increased arterial stretch from the high blood pressure, and so we're going to do parasympathetic stimulation this time, and we're going to decrease the stroke volume, heart rate, and therefore the blood pressure, as well as we're going to cause vasodilation of blood vessels, so the blood vessels are going to be less tight, and hence there's going to be less pressure. Now, we've looked at baroreceptors, let's look at chemoreceptors. So, when there's decreased blood flow to tissues, we're going to see that CO2 levels are going to increase and pH levels are going to decrease. Okay, because pH levels decrease, it means it's getting more acid. Okay, and this is because our CO2 is going to dissolve in blood, forming something called carbonic acid. Okay, and carbonic acid is going to release hydrogen ions, which lower blood pH, making the blood more acidic. So these two factors are related. Okay, the increase in CO2 is going to cause the decrease in pH, and so chemoreceptors are going to detect this, and they're going to signal central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, the structure we've just looked at, and it's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, because remember that the problem was decreased blood flow, and so the medulla's ventilation centers are going to respond by increasing the activity of the diaphragm contractions, intercostal muscle contractions, and hence increasing ventilation rate. Okay, and so we're going to increase heart rate, fixing the low blood flow by increasing blood flow, if that makes sense. And now we're going to deliver more oxygen, removing all of this increased CO2 and hence increasing the pH, okay, making it more alkali and not as acid. This is a moment where you're like, oh, school might actually help me with life. Well, this is an example of that. If we're looking at our circadian rhythm, it's gonna basically be this clock in our brains, in our nervous systems, that's gonna track our body the 24 hours of the day. Okay, it's gonna impact our body temperature alertness hormones, and blood pressure. So many factors. Okay, the pineal gland of the brain, okay, is going to secrete melatonin, which is the sleep hormone. So it's very important. Photoreceptors, okay, remember photosynthesis, light, signal the hypothalamus of day and night, okay, because they're going to detect the light intensity. The more light intensity, it means it's daytime, and the less it's nighttime. Okay. Now, if we look at melatonin and its levels during the day, okay, we're going to see the following. At midnight, okay, it's going to peak. So you see this decrease, okay, this is from the past day, it's decreasing. There's a day drop. Okay, during the day, melatonin levels are low. Okay, your sleep hormone levels are low, and that makes sense because you don't feel sleepy during the day, hopefully, unless you're sleep deprived. Okay. Now during the evening, as we get closer to nighttime, there's going to be an increase. There's going to be more melatonin. Your body temperature is going to decrease, and this means essentially that you're preparing for sleep. Now, as I said before, there's going to be a midnight peak. Okay, melatonin levels are the highest here when you're sleeping, and that makes sense. And again, the day drop comes back. During stressful or emotional or scary situations, the body's going to do the following to respond. Okay, these are also known as fight or flight situations. Well, the hypothalamus is going to detect the stress, and through the autonomic or automatic nervous system, it's going to send signals to your adrenal glands on the medulla to secrete epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. Okay, and the following effects will happen. There's an increase in heart rate and breathing rate, glycogenolysis, which means the breakdown of glycogen. Okay, glyco for glycogen, lysis for breaking down, is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. Okay, so you're going to have increased blood sugar levels, increased glucose levels, so you have more energy to, for example, run away. And also your senses will sharpen. Okay, so your eyesight's going to be better. You're going to hear and smell everything better. That again links to helping you run away, for example. More brain oxygen supply. This links with the sharpening of senses. Okay, skeletal muscle. Okay, so remember that's muscle attached to bones. So their blood vessels will dilate. So there's more nutrients and oxygen. Okay, again linked to movement. The endocrine system is also known as our command center, where the hypothalamus is carrying the following functions: the secretion of hormones that stimulate or inhibit the pituitary gland, which we're going to look at in a second. It links the nervous and endocrine systems. Okay, it's going to maintain homeostasis. This is a different topic in the IB course, and it's going to synthesize the hormones oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Okay, you don't need to know this in a lot of detail, but it's good to mention it. So the pituitary gland is also known as the master gland because it's going to secrete a lot of different hormones. We're going to look at that into more detail right now. I'm not sure if you need to memorize all of this, but it's good to have a look at it. It is in the syllabus after all. So basically the trend is that the hypothalamus is going to secrete a certain hormone, and this is going to impact a different hormone on the pituitary gland. Okay, so for example, if we release growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, this is going to cause the pituitary gland to secrete growth hormone. Simple as that. And then there's going to be an effect on the muscle. Okay, what does growth hormone do? Well, it's going to grow bones and muscles. So that's it. Essentially, this is the trend. The hypothalamus secretes a hormone, which makes the pituitary gland secrete another hormone, which has an effect on the body. But there's also more specific hormones. Okay, so if the hypothalamus secretes somatostatin, for example, it's going to inhibit or stop the secretion of a certain hormone and start secreting a different hormone. Okay, and in some cases there's no clear effect on the body. Okay, for example, prolactin inhibiting hormone. Okay, what's going to do? Inhibit prolactin, contrary to releasing